When Adaeze picked up the red wig, she thought it was just hair, but it was the memory of a forgotten spirit. This African folktale reveals why not everything left behind is meant to be found. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and be a part of our family for more powerful tales like this. They always forbade everyone not to go near the hut behind the palm grove, mothers warned. Elders cursed, and children told each other ghost stories about the twisted vines that grew through its roof and the humming that came from within during the harmattan. But curiosity is a fire, and Adaeze had always been warm. That day, while the sun pressed heavy on the thatched roofs and even the goats lay quiet, she slipped away from her mother's yam stall and wandered down the narrow path that split through the forest like a scar. The hut appeared from nowhere, like a memory hiding in plain sight. It was crooked, swallowed by leaves, with a wooden door carved in ancient symbols and a whisper of singing drifting from within. Something about the sound felt familiar, soft and broken, like a lullaby hummed too many years after it was needed. Inside, it was dim and cool. Dust danced in the light from a cracked window. On a stool sat a red wig, not made of thread or wool, but fine hair, glimmering like sunset on blood. As she reached out, she felt the room hold its breath. The moment her fingers touched it, everything changed. A mirror grew from the far wall like a blooming leaf, and in its surface, Adaeze saw herself, but not quite. Her eyes were older, her smile cruel, and her voice was not her own. She ran tripping over a root, scraping her elbow, ignoring the stinging pain and the way the air around the hut hissed like it had a mouth. But the wig clung to her head like it was part of her skin. Her breath came in hard, shivering bursts as she burst back into sunlight, but the warmth didn't help. The coldness followed her. She told no one. That night, she dreamt of thrones made of braided hair, of women with skin like ivory and eyes like fire. One of them stood closest, watching her from beneath a crown of broken combs. "You gave me what no one else did," the woman whispered. "Now I give you remembrance." When she woke, the wig was still there, seamless, rooted, alive. Her mother shrieked when she saw it. Her father made the sign against evil. But the village priestess only stared with a long, tired sadness and said, "It has chosen her." From that moment, Adaeze was not just a girl anymore. Chickens fled from her steps. Water in calabashes trembled when she passed. She could hear voices in the wind, old ones that remembered too much. The hut behind the grove stayed silent, but Adaeze knew something had followed her home, and it was watching. On the third day, Adaeze saw someone else in her reflection. Not always just in flashes when water shimmered wrong or shadows flickered too long. The woman was beautiful, terrifying, sad. Queen Nettie. Adaeze had heard of her in whispered tales, an ancient ruler who had ruled through charm and wrath. Betrayed by her kin, her spirit banished into the forest by jealous elders. They said she swore to return one day, carried not by war, but by memory. Now Adaeze carried her voice in her dreams. The wig whispered in her sleep. It hummed when she was quiet. And still she told no one. At dusk, children stopped playing when she passed. At dawn, birds no longer sang near her window. Her mother left food at the threshold, but never entered. Only Grandma Ifeoma dared speak to her. The crown remembers kindness. You fed a soul. Once forgotten, now she remembers you. That night, Adaeze stood before her cracked mirror and said aloud, "If I am chosen, show me the truth." The mirror shimmered. Behind her, Queen Nettie stood smiling. "You must walk where I could not," she said. "And when the time comes, choose what I never did, forgiveness." The next morning, the sky turned gray, though no clouds moved. Adaeze walked to the hut again. This time, it opened before she touched it. The vines unwound, the door groaned like a beast waking up. Inside, the air was thick with incense, and candles she hadn't lit flickered along the walls. On the stool, the red wig glowed faintly, She sat before the mirror, and this time she did not flinch. Queen Nettie stood behind her. "I was betrayed because I loved power more than peace," she said. "You have a chance to choose both." Adaeze asked, "Why me?" The queen's reflection did not blink. "Because you gave bread to a beggar who once had a throne." The memory returned, sudden and sharp. Adaeze, as a child, offering bread to a ragged woman no one would look at. The woman had smiled then, and vanished by morning. Now that woman had given her a gift or a burden. "I am not a queen," Adaeze said. "But you are," the mirror replied. "A queen of what comes next." Outside, the wind picked up. The vines closed again. And Adaeze stood, taller than before, the wig burning with soft light. Whatever came next, she would face it, not as a girl, not as a ghost, but as something entirely new. The village of Umuako didn't recognize her when she returned. They saw the same face, the same feet hardened by dusty roads, the same Adaeze. They'd watched grow beside yam fields and clay ovens, but something in her had shifted, like a drum now beat behind her eyes. Chickens hushed when she passed. Children tugged on their mother's wrappers and asked, "Why is she glowing?" Adaeze no longer flinched at whispers. She heard them, all, the living, the dead, even the unborn. She no longer slept much because dreams had become doors. At night she sat beneath the old iroko tree, where the ground cracked from roots thick as ancestors' bones, and Queen Nettie spoke to her from wind and memory. "You carry more than my voice now," the queen said. "You carry choice." The village priestess came to her with a basket of kola nuts and a bowed head, saying, "You walk between two worlds. Speak carefully." Even her mother began to greet her like a stranger, placing food outside her hut without knocking. Adaeze still wore the red wig, but now it felt lighter, like a crown that could float or burn, depending on how she carried it. But the villagers did not see royalty. They saw a storm clothed in their daughter's skin. And some began to murmur. No good ever comes from spirits returning with human feet. On the third day after her return, the drought began. The river slowed into silence. Frogs stopped singing at dusk, and even the air felt thirsty. Adaeze heard the earth groaning under the strain of being ignored. When the villagers came to her hut, their heads bowed low and their eyes heavy with desperation, she already knew what they'd ask. "Fix it," they whispered. "Bring the rain." But Queen Nettie's voice answered through her. "The land remembers those who give." So Adaeze stood before the village fire that evening, the red wig blazing like a second sun, and told them to return to the grove with gifts, not prayers, not fear, but offerings from the soul. "Give what matters to you," she said. "So the land will remember you matter to it." Some scoffed. "We are not fools," one man barked. "She is just a girl." But others listened. A widow brought her late husband's walking staff. A young mother laid down her only gold bangle. Adaeze placed each offering beneath the roots of the iroko tree, whispering words in a language only the land remembered. That night, thunder cracked. The sky, rain fell in sheets, and the river returned humming like it never left. The doubters muttered about coincidence. The believers cried and danced. But Adaeze didn't celebrate. She sat alone in her hut, the wig resting on her lap, and asked the shadows, how many more debts must be paid for this crown to stop feeling borrowed? The rain fed the village, but news of Adaeze's power traveled faster than the floodwaters. From the north came messengers, from the south, gifts, from the west, warnings, and from the east came a chieftain from Oru, known for his cruel hand and quick anger, riding with 5 warriors and a demand that Adaeze join his court as a keeper of balance or be taken as a divine prize. He spoke to her like a merchant talks to a goat, smiling, condescending, sure of his purchase. But Adaeze stood barefoot, rainwater trickling down her arms, her eyes still as river stones. She reached into her satchel and lifted the wig, holding it like a question. "Wear it," she said. if you think you can command what it remembers." The chieftain laughed, snatched it from her hands, and forced it onto his head. The moment it touched his scalp, he staggered back, howling in voices not his own, a woman's scream, a child's sob, a drum's warning. He collapsed in the mud. The wig smoking, his men fled without looking back. Adaeze said nothing. She picked up the wig, still warm with power, and returned it to her satchel. That night, she sat by candlelight and stared at it, wondering if mercy had a limit. Because even mercy, if wielded too easily, starts to feel like vengeance. That night, Queen Nettie came again, but something had changed. Her face was softer. Her voice cracked, not with rage, but with grief. "You wear me like armor," she said, "but I was never meant to be worn forever." Adaeze asked, then, "What am I meant to become?" Nettie knelt beside her in the dream, touching her forehead. "You are meant to choose. I never did. I only punished. You can end the story differently." The next morning, before the first rooster crowed, Adaeze stood before the village again. She held the red wig high above her head, not with pride, but with reverence, and said, "This is no longer mine to carry. I am not Queen Nettie. I am Adaeze, daughter of Ifeoma, and I choose to be seen as myself." She walked to the edge of the forest where the earth still whispered of old things, and buried the wig in a pit of salt and ash. The ground hissed. The wind rose and spun leaves like spirits. Then silence, peace. The drought didn't return. The river stayed full. And Adaeze, walking back into the village with her head held high and her hands empty, finally felt full, for she had given power back to the earth and taken memory back into her own heart. It began the night after the burial. Adaeze couldn't sleep, not from fear, but from stillness too perfect to trust. The crickets were silent. The wind refused to move. Even the trees stood frozen, as though listening. When she did drift off near dawn, her dreams were cracked into fragments, broken mirrors, ash blowing across water, and a voice not Queen Nettie's, but deeper, older, whispering, "What you bury with salt does not forget, it waits." Adaeze awoke with a pounding heart and an ache in her feet, and when she stepped outside, she found footprints, small, wet, and barefoot, leading away from the spot where she had buried the wig. The soil was disturbed, the salt circle cracked. The offering had been moved. She called for the priestess, for her grandmother, even for the silent gods, but none had answers. That evening, a child fell sick. By morning, 3 others followed. Not with fever or plague, but with dreams they couldn't escape. One muttered of hair wrapping around his throat. Another spoke fluent words from a language lost for generations. A girl, only 5, whispered Adaeze's name in her sleep, and then Queen Nettie's. Something had taken root where the wig had lain, and now it was blooming underground. The sickness didn't spread like disease, but like memory. Those affected seemed pulled into another time, staring at fire as if they were queens or warriors from long-dead clans. A mother slapped her son when he called her by the name of a woman who had died before the Biafran War. A young hunter came running, screaming that he had seen the river goddess in the well, her hair coiled like a serpent. The village grew restless. Some whispered that Adaeze had awakened the dead. Others demanded she fix what she had started. She returned to the burial site, heart pounding, and began to dig. The pit was empty. But beside it sat something new, a braid of red hair, twisted, tight, humming faintly. She picked it up. It was warm, alive, and as she touched it, she felt every memory it held pour into her. The rage of Nettie, the betrayal of queens, the grief of daughters never born. She dropped it and fell to her knees. "This isn't mine," she cried. "I gave it back." But the wind around her whispered, "You don't choose when memory ends. You only choose how it's remembered." That night, the village's elders gathered beneath the moon. For the first time in years, the great drum was brought out, the one only used when a soul had returned to the land wrongly. The priestess looked at Adaeze, not with blame, but with pity. "You became a vessel," she said. "Now you must become a bridge." She instructed Adaeze to go into the forest alone and find the tree of returning, where spirits who cannot rest sometimes gather. "If the red thread has woken," she said, "it means a story was left unfinished." So Adaeze walked beneath a moon so bright it felt like judgment. The forest opened for her, the vines curling back as though it remembered her too. At the tree tall twisted leaves black as charcoal, she found a ring of hair tied around the base, and heard dozens of whispers echoing between the bark. "Tell them who I really was," one said. "Let them remember my child," said another. "I died with truth in my mouth," cried a third. These were the voices of women erased from history, wives accused of sorcery, queens betrayed by kin, mothers who died in silence. The wig had not been cursed, it had been a vessel of remembrance. And now, without it, they had nowhere to go but through the living. When Adaeze returned to the village, she did not speak for 2 days. She fasted. She wept. She knelt at her ancestors' altar and offered her own braids as tribute. And then she called the village to gather. Under the great tree, she told them everything, not as a girl touched by spirits, but as a voice for the forgotten. She named the women whose names had been erased. She recited the lives woven into the red wig. She told them that Queen Nettie was not only power and wrath, but also grief and memory, and that the land was now remembering the stories it had been forced to forget. "We are haunted," she said, "not by spirits but by our own silence." The villagers wept. Some came forward with offerings, not of wealth, but of truth. Hidden names, quiet apologies, buried songs. That night, the air shifted. The dreams ceased. The braid of red hair no longer pulsed. And in the center of the burial pit, a single flower bloomed red as blood, soft as forgiveness. Adaeze picked it gently. The wig was truly gone. But the memory had taken root where it belonged, not in hair, but in hearts. The peace did not last long. Just 8 days after the braid was buried and the flower bloomed, a stranger entered Umuako. He wore traveler's robes stained with dust and time, and his eyes were a storm, not wild, but deep, full of things held too long. He arrived at dawn when the fog was still soft over the fields, and asked the first boy he saw, "Where's the girl with the red crown?" The boy ran to the elders. The elders called for Adaeze. She stepped into the square calmly, already feeling a tremor in her chest. The man turned to her and smiled faintly. "Nene," he said, "you haven't aged." The name struck her like thunder. No one in the village had ever called her that. Adaeze froze. "You are mistaken," she said. "My name is Adaeze." The man nodded. "Yes, now, but before, when you walked among the keepers, you were Enme, the last witness of the red line." The crowd murmured. Adaeze's hands trembled. The red wig was gone, the voices silenced, but somehow this man had stirred something far older in her, something she didn't know she had forgotten. "Who are you?" she asked. "I was your brother," he said quietly, "in the last life." The elders demanded the stranger leave, fearing his words would reignite things best left buried. But Adaeze asked for one night to speak with him. In the firelight, they sat beneath the iroko tree, and he told her stories, not from books, but from echoes, of a forgotten order called the Keepers of the Red Line, chosen to remember the lineage of lost queens. Of a final gathering where one woman, the youngest, sacrificed herself to carry the memories alone, weaving them into hair, into song, into silence. "You were her," he said. "You became the vessel and wore the red crown not just in this life, but again and again." Adaeze listened, torn between doubt and recognition. "But I buried it," she said. "I freed myself." The man smiled gently. "You ended the burden," he said. "But memory, it finds its way back." He handed her a piece of cloth. Inside It was a pendant etched with the same spiral vine as the door of the old hut. "You were never cursed," he said. "You were entrusted." That night, Adaeze dreamt not of Queen Nettie or of voices from the trees, but of herself, seated on a high rock overlooking fire and sea. Around her were women with long red braids, whispering names, laughing, crying, stitching lines of memory into fabric. One of them reached for her and said, "It is time to choose what kind of keeper you will be." In the morning, she woke lighter, though the weight of her calling hadn't left. The pendant glowed warm against her chest. Adaeze walked to the center of the village and called the people to gather. She told them of the keepers, of the truth behind the wig, the braid, the whispers. "I am no longer a vessel," she said, "but I remember. And if we forget again, we will become what once haunted us." She placed the pendant in a bowl and lit it with sacred oil. The flames flickered tall but silent. From the fire, a scent of hibiscus and salt filled the air. A woman in the crowd gasped, remembering a lullaby her mother sang before vanishing during the famine. Others cried. Stories returned like migrating birds. The stranger stayed for 3 days. On the 4th, he disappeared without farewell, but in his place, a scroll had been left beneath Adaeze's mat sealed with red wax and marked, "For when the sky forgets again." Adaeze did not open it. Not yet. Instead, she gathered children at the base of the tree each evening and taught them the real stories ones, with names, not silence. She wove braids into their hair while speaking the names of lost queens and forgotten mothers. The flower at the burial site had multiplied. Now a ring of them surrounded the old salt pit, red and gentle, blooming in perfect silence. No one called her a witch anymore. No one left food outside her hut in fear. They greeted her with respect, not because of the past she carried, but because of the future she dared to tell. In the sky, clouds moved freely again. The river hummed. And though Adaeze still walked with memory in her veins, it no longer roared, it sang, softly, clearly, and through her, it became a song the whole village began to learn. It came without thunder or warning, just a child's knock on the door. One misty morning, Adaeze opened it to find a girl no older than 10, standing barefoot with leaves in her hair and a single red braid tucked behind her ear. The girl didn't speak right away. She simply stared at Adaeze with wide, expectant eyes, the way a drum waits to be struck. Then she held out a small bundle of cloth and whispered, "My dreams are too loud." Inside the cloth was a tiny wig, brilliant red, woven tight, humming like it remembered something Adaeze hadn't yet said aloud. The villagers gathered around slowly, sensing something was beginning again. The priestess nodded once and left without speaking. The elders sat in silence. Adaeze knew what this meant. The line had chosen. But this time, it hadn't waited for death or fire or silence to carry it forward. It had come in the form of a girl seeking help. The burden was offering itself not as punishment, but as legacy. And Adaeze, for the first time, was not being claimed. She was being asked. That night, Adaeze took the girl whose name was Chittibum to the burial site, where the red flowers now bloomed in a perfect circle. The earth around it pulsed gently under their feet, as if recognizing a heartbeat returned. They sat together, beneath the stars, and Adaeze told her everything, not just of Queen Nettie and the voices, but of silence, of fear, of choice. "You don't have to take this," she said, placing the tiny wig in Chittibum's lap. "You're allowed to say no. You're allowed to walk away." But the girl shook her head and replied, "I've heard them since I was born. They're quieter when I listen." Adaeze smiled through tears. This was not what she had feared. This was what healing looked like when a burden became a bridge. The girl lay down beside the roots and fell asleep instantly. The wind around them slowed. No fire burst, no voice shouted. Just peace. And for Adaeze, that silence was the clearest answer of all. In the weeks that followed, Adaeze didn't wear the pendant anymore. She placed it in the shrine, beside old charms and ancestor stones, where others could find it if they needed to. Remember, Chittibum stayed with her, learning how to speak names with reverence and how to walk slowly in places where spirits lingered. Together, they braided hair and stories into the heads of children. The tree at the edge of the village, once the site of burial and burning, now grew new fruit. Birds returned. Even strangers who passed through the village commented on the strange peace that hovered in the air, like a song sung just under breath. Adaeze was no longer feared. Nor was she worshipped. She was known. And that was the most sacred thing of all. She knew now that the line of memory didn't need wigs or mirrors or haunting dreams. It only needed space to be spoken, ears to listen, and someone brave enough to pass it on. 1 year later, the red flower bloomed only once, and when it did, Adaeze plucked it gently, dried its petals, and tucked them into a book of stories she and Chittibum had written together. They titled it, "For the Ones We Couldn't Bury Properly." Inside were names once lost, tales once whispered, and lessons earned through tears. On the last page, Adaeze wrote one line in ink that glowed faintly under moonlight. "I was not the last keeper, only the first who chose." Then she closed the book, placed it on the shrine, and walked out into the grove where the wind no longer hissed but hummed in harmony. The village watched her go, not with grief, but with gratitude. Chittibum stood at the edge, holding the new stories in her arms. The line had not ended. It had blossomed. And far away, in some unborn time, another child would one day find something red in the dark and remember.